Arrived at the Tulsa World newspaper in 1979 as a sports writer and has been there ever since. He's reported on a wide range of topics, including college football, boxing, politics, and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. In 1999, he was assigned to cover the Tulsa race riot, a panel established by the Oklahoma legislature to investigate the events of May 31st to June 1st, 1921, and their aftermath, and thus began 20 years of research culminating in his book, Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre, which has won many honors, including the Oklahoma Historical Society's Book of the Year. And I see Dan Rosenblum is holding it up right now. And Dan Rosenblum, our own Dan Rosenblum, will be interviewing Randy. Dan has been a member of the Bergen Society for over 2 decades. He's a researcher at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School in Newark, where he focuses both on statistical analysis for epidemiological research and community outreach on public health matters. He's also past chair of the Ethical Society's Social Action Committee. Dan, I'll invite you to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Randy, for joining us. This book was fascinating and informative, very informative. I think you crammed every detail that was covered by the media back then into it. Maybe there's a lot more. I presume there is a lot more. But let me just start by inviting you, for the benefit of those who don't know what happened in Tulsa in 1921, to give a summary of what happened then and why it's such a significant event in both Tulsa's history and more broadly the history of the United States. This is sort of your chance to introduce everyone to the topic, because I don't think everyone knows about it.
Sure, and first of all, I want to apologize for being a little late joining you today. But this event occurred, I think, as was mentioned earlier, on the evening of May 31st, June 1st, 1921. And Tulsa at that time was a really fast-growing place, pretty much a transient population. By some calculations, 3/4 of the population had lived there less than 10 years. It had gone from a couple of thousand people in 1900 to over 70,000 people in 1920. And this was almost entirely because of oil. A lot of the oil that was used during World War I to power the Allied armies and navies came through Tulsa, and that's where Tulsa really made its first millions, as it were. Its first millionaires was in World War I. Tulsa, or Oklahoma in general, was a Jim Crow state, and Tulsa was probably not quite as segregated as some places, but it was still very segregated. And so on May the 30th, which happened to be Memorial Day, there was some sort of incident on a downtown elevator that involved a young black man and a young black woman. It's not exactly clear what happened, but anyway, the result of it was a black man was arrested. He was put in the city jail. There was a telephone threat against his life, and they moved him to the county jail, which was more secure and was about 6 blocks away. All of this activity caused a couple of things. One was rumors that something was going to happen, that they were going to try and take this fella out of the jail. There had actually been a white man taken from the Tulsa County Jail the previous summer in 1920 and lynched. But we had a new sheriff, And this sheriff was determined that that was not going to happen. And he pretty much barricaded the young black man who was known as Dick Rowland and some deputies in the jail, which was on the top floor of the courthouse, very difficult to access if resistance was put up. But as a result of these threats, a number of black men armed themselves, went to the courthouse, made it clear they were going to protect Dick Rowland. So black guys, to get there, they had to go right through the white downtown. In other words, the jail is on the southwest corner of the downtown area. The Greenwood district, which was a pretty large and relatively prosperous black neighborhood, was on the northeast side of downtown. So they had to go through the white downtown, a bunch of armed black men. And this upset a lot of white folks. And at some point, a shot was fired. And the most common story is that this was the result of a white civilian trying to disarm a black man, and the gun went off. And when the gun went off, then that's what everything started. Shooting back and forth through the night. And on the early morning of June the 1st, the National Guard and some other whites went in and removed all the blacks who were left. A lot of them had already fled. They went in and took into custody all the black people they could. Any blacks that resisted were subject to being shot. And once that was done, then the black community was burned to the ground, 35 square blocks. And so this was a very intense episode. There have been, and in that general time period, there had been a lot of racial conflict in the United States, Chicago, Washington, D.C. New York had some off and on for many years, going back to colonial days. East St. Louis, Phillips County, Arkansas, all over the place. But this one was particularly intense, and it received a lot of attention nationally and even internationally, and continued to do so for about 3 or 4 months. But by the end of 1921, it had largely left the public consciousness in a lot of ways. And as time went on, people kind of forgot about it. I think a lot of that in Tulsa was intentional. People it was a very traumatic event. A lot of people were very embarrassed about it. They didn't want to talk about it. About the 50th anniversary, in the early 1970s, it began to thaw out, excuse me, a little bit. In the late 1990s, there was a state commission to look into it. And all of that spurred a lot of interest. And I would say over the last 20 years, and especially the last 4 or 5 years, what had always been known as the Tulsa Race Riot, but is now generally called the Massacre, has become, sort of a focal point for all sorts of conflicts and wrongs and grievances. And I don't mean that in a negative. I think grievances has sometimes lately come to have a negative connotation, but I mean, these were real grievances. It's kind of become a focal point for all of that. And it was one of the worst, if not, some people will say it's the worst. Some people will say it's one of the worst. I tend to go with one of the worst because it's kind of hard to measure these things, but it was certainly one of the most violent and one of the most destructive incidents of racial violence, especially black-white violence in the 20th century.
So let's follow up a little bit more on that. You go into a lot of detail in the book about right after the massacre, the debates among Tulsa's white citizens about whether to prevent, allow, or encourage Blacks to rebuild their homes and their community in the northeast part of Tulsa, with some people wanting to basically completely repurpose that area as an industrial and what we would now call transshipment zone, and others saying, no, 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 we have to let people rebuild. I get the sense from the book that, it's clear that ultimately the notion of pushing the whole Black population further to the northeast and converting that into an industrial zone did not win out. It sounds like more because there was no way to finance that rather than because of some magnanimous, rather than because of the prevalence of the magnanimous opinion among the white population. There was certainly some. But it does raise the question, do you have a sense of how the Black people were able to rebuild? Because it sounds like they got very little external assistance and that they had lost most of their capital in the form of their houses, and even in many cases, the cash they had stored in their houses because they didn't trust banks and things like that. We able to get any answers to questions like, how did the Black population get the capital to rebuild in Greenwood? And for that matter, how did the Black people fare during the winter of 2021 to 22? Because it sounds like not everything was rebuilt by the end of the warm season. Did you get any information on either of those?
Some, and how Greenwood was rebuilt remains to some extent a little bit of a mystery. But I would offer several things. In some cases, it was just a matter of whether people kept their money in a bank or not. In the early 1920s, people tended not to trust banks. There was no such thing as federal deposit insurance. And so if a bank went under, you lost everything. And of course, a lot of Black folks didn't have that much anyway. But it appears that some of the merchants who were relatively prosperous kept their money in one of the downtown banks, or in a downtown bank, not necessarily one particular bank. And so they had some money with which to rebuild. I think that there was probably some degree of individual assistance or direct assistance. And by that, I mean, there didn't seem to be much appetite for just going in and saying, we're going to give everybody who lost their house $500, which at that time would have been not a ton of money, but it would have been enough to put together some kind of a little house. There wasn't much appetite for that, but there does seem to have been a certain number of white folks who said, I like Joe over here, and so I'm going to help him rebuild. Maybe Joe worked for him, probably did, or, there was that sort of thing. At one point, I kind of just at random started tracing a parcel of land in that area just to see what was going on. And it appeared that the lot had belonged to a Black plumber. And it looked like every once in a while he would get a little loan from a white plumber in town. And that would go on the land records. Now, I don't know if they worked together. I don't know what their relationship was, but it seems like there was a certain amount of that. There were also some Black folks who moved into the city because of the massacre. In other words, there's a fairly prominent family here, and I know some of them fairly well. And they had an uncle here, or there was one member of the family here, and he was a builder. And after the massacre, he sent the word to his family members in South Carolina and said, "Why don't you come up here? We're doing there's a lot of construction work here." And so these guys were carpenters, and they came up and probably brought, a little bit of investment with them. I don't know for sure. And then, I guess there was a certain amount of institutional lending, although I think most of that probably came from outside the city. By institutional lending, I mean like a savings and loan or an insurance company or a bank or something like that. But capital, I think, was always a problem for black folks because there weren't any black-owned banks. And I think, lots of times the white banks were very skeptical about making loans to black people, aside from whatever prejudice they might have, was just the fact that in most cases, black people were kind of confined in as far as their earning ability.
And in terms of that following winter, as I mentioned earlier, how did
I think, so by, the end of December, most of the people were out of tents, but not all of them. And I haven't seen an awful lot of information about that, but I do think that, there were a lot of black people in Tulsa before the massacre who had a hard time getting through the winter. So there had to be a lot of them afterwards who did. And, it's hard to calculate population. There were a lot of black people who left and never came back. But there were also a lot who, the men sent their families out of town while they tried to get back on their feet. And so the population was probably not as much as it had been directly before and as much as it would be soon after. So I don't really have a good answer to that other than to say there were some people who were living in tents, and these tents were, the Red Cross had come in and constructed a lot of these tents, and they had, the Red Cross tents had wood floors and wooden sides and canvas tops. They weren't exactly sleeping on the ground, but they certainly weren't the lap of luxury either. So I think, and there were a few houses that had survived, but even those had been badly vandalized and that sort of thing. So I think that winter was probably pretty tough. However, I think most people were indoors by that time. Okay,
so a few questions I had about attitudes and how the papers were covering them. I should just explain to everyone here that Mr. Krehbiel's book focuses on, or is based on, how the newspaper, more than any other source, certainly not the only source, but how the newspapers in Tulsa at the time were covering and portraying the events. It's not the only, his is not the only history that's been written in the last couple of decades about the Tulsa Massacre. And that's, Randy, your specific focus. So you described a lot about how the two newspapers, the World and the Tribune, were covering the event. You mentioned in a few places that there was one newspaper based in the Black community, and that was A.J. Smitherman's Tulsa Star. Was that still publishing by the time of the massacre? And if so, to what extent did it cover things, or had that stopped publication by that point?
It was still publishing, and in fact, it played kind of a role in events leading up to the massacre, but it was its printing plant was destroyed during the massacre, and the publisher, A.J. Smitherman, fled the city, he was probably going to be charged with a pretty serious, he's facing some pretty serious charges if he stuck around. And so he actually wound up in Buffalo, New York, where he published a newspaper for many years. So there's no, that particular paper, there's no coverage of the actual massacre because it ended when the massacre occurred. Now there's a black newspaper in Oklahoma City called the Black Dispatch that had some coverage of it, and that was actually pretty helpful to me.
So we get a lot of information from the World and the Tribune. Did they afford much coverage, the World and the Tribune only, of Black people's reactions and voices, or were they pretty much limited to covering the views and opinions of white people in Tulsa?
Yeah, I don't think, one of the things that I really came to understand during all of this was just how little the opinions of Black people mattered in that time. Lots of times it wasn't so, today we think about racism in terms of hatred. To me, it was not so much a matter of hatred as it was indifference, or, we don't really care what you do as long as you show up to work and you work for 25 cents an hour and, and you stay on your side of the town. But so to answer your question, no, there wasn't much. The World had a reporter named Faith Hieronymus, who was the only reporter in the local papers to get a byline during the massacre. And bylines were not commonly given in those days, but she did go to the minor league baseball park where a lot of the Black folks were being held on June the 1st. And she interviewed people and they published that story. And it was insightful into both white and Black frame of mind, because you had what the Black people were saying, and then you had the way the white reporter and the white editors were presenting it. She was fairly sympathetic to them, and yet there's some things that come through, and something that she didn't really have anything to do with, I don't think. In the way newspapers were laid out in those days, and even still are today, you break up the type by putting a little subhead in a long story. And this one had a subhead that said "Black but human," and so it's kind of that's kind of revealing. The Tribune was more dismissive. The Tribune had been wanting to. They didn't have bulldozers in those days, but if they'd had bulldozers, it would have wanted to bulldoze Greenwood before the massacre. And so they were pretty dismissive of them. A lot of the reporting was in, I guess you'd say, vernacular. In other words, it was written phonetically and made the Black folks for the most part sound pretty uneducated and step and fetch it kind of stuff. Yeah. And there were also a couple of interviews with Barney Cleaver, who was the Black sheriff's deputy. It was a pretty prominent figure in town. He seems to have been the Black person most highly regarded on both sides of the railroad track. Yeah, but of course, and then there were a few comments from some other people as time went along during the summer of 1921. When I'm reading them, I'm thinking, okay, is this what they really think, or is this what they think the white people who are going to read this paper want to hear? And it's hard to know.
Right, and that's, I guess, is always a problem when you're, I guess, when a dominant group is interviewing or covering a group that's sort of on the receiving end of oppression is how much they can afford to be honest, without all kinds of repercussions hitting them. So one of the things that struck me as I was reading the various views expressed by white people, especially after the massacre, was that the range seemed to be from Black people are inferior, or they may not have said inferior, but Black people are intrinsically limited to doing servile tasks, but we still have to treat them with respect. To Black people are the scum of the earth, and it would really be better if they didn't exist. That's my sense was that was the range. I'm especially interested in were there people even further on the equality side than what I saw noted in the reports that you quoted? Because certainly the idea of Black equality, although it may have been very much a minority idea in the country, was not new. I mean, you can go back to Wendell Phillips or Thomas Wentworth Higginson or the Grimke sisters in the abolitionist community, who more than many of the white abolitionists actually thought Blacks were completely equal. And of course, in the Black community, you already had people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who, by the way, was close to the ethical culture movement. Cyril Briggs was new to me. Was an interesting person reading the book, even more radical than Du Bois at that time. But in terms of within the white community, were there people even further on the equality side that you came across in your research, or did my description of that range pretty much capture it?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is that there was a lot of discussion at that time about legal rights or legal equality versus social equality. And there were a lot of whites who accepted legal equality. That meant if a Black person wound up in court, or if they had a dispute with a white person, they deserved the same consideration under the law as a white person. And lots of times that was argued not on the basis of that the Black people were actually equal, but that the white people as the superior race should be, showing that they really, I guess, it's to us today, I think it's a pretty tortured logic. Then there was the social equality, and that was much more controversial. There were a lot of people who, didn't want Black people shot and hung and robbed and, treated in that manner, but that didn't mean they wanted to sit next to them in a movie theater or have their kids sit next to them in school. And so those were the two big groups, but apparently there were people, and they're not real apparent in any of the writing or reporting, not just in the Tulsa papers, but anywhere, who believed in, who were willing to stand up for true social equality. And I say that only because of some of the comments of the more radical segregationists. There was a Methodist minister in town named Cook, Harold Cook, who he went on a rant about, the lowest human being on the earth is the white person who would put the Black person on the same plane as him, that they were the worst of humanity. And so the fact that he was upset about that leads me to believe there must have been some people who did that. And a lot of it was, I think sometimes white people would sort of say one thing and do another, and in both ways. The Black people seemed to hold Maurice Willows, who was the man that the Red Cross sent in to run the relief operations. They held him in high regard. And if you read some of the things that Willows said, you might think, well, I'm not so sure about that, but my inclination is to think that he said what he needed to say to keep the Black people fed and clothed and in their home, or in some kind of a shelter. but that in his personal dealings with them, you know, they felt a real attachment to him. So, you know, I think there were a lot of people, a lot of white people who were kind of struggling with this idea of, you know, how do we handle this? And I think so. I hope I'm not getting too far away here, but over time, I've come to think more and more about the economic implications of racism. And so, if you go back into the, you know, 1700s, and then especially in the early 1800s, there was a huge economic incentive for racism, because, you know, you want to convince yourself and these people that they're inferior, so you can force them to do work for you, right? Probably by the early 20th century, that economic incentive was declining. You know, we still had a lot of Black folks who were living in, you know, virtual peonage is what they called it. It was only about a half an inch removed from slavery. But for a lot of people who lived in a city or a city like Tulsa, the Black, you know, the incentive was a lot less. You know, they still did menial work. Black folks still were largely relegated to menial work, and they were salaried. And so if you treated them as equal, you might have to pay them more, but that's still a little bit further removed. So I think, you know, as the economic incentive for racism declined, people began to question this more.
Right. Well, that sort of leads to yet a sort of more current question. You compare in your last chat. By the way, Willows comes across as certainly one of the more honorable people in this whole affair. You compare views and attitudes in 1920s Tulsa with those of Tulsa today, mentioning both in fact, discussing more than mentioning, both the commission that the state set up to basically explore the history of the massacre, as well as how Tulsa responded to some particular cases of white police on Black person killing. And you discussed what has changed and what people are not willing to confront as well. What are your thoughts on the value of better education about and awareness of the Tulsa Massacre today? What's the value of learning about this now?
Well, you know, so if you live in Tulsa, there's a kind of an obvious value in that it's part of the reason we are whatever it is we are today, and it still has. You know, what you find out is that sometimes things that happened in the past, the thing themselves has been forgotten, but there are still remnants of that in the patterns of growth or relationships between different groups of people, or relationships between the people and the city government. And, you know, we probably see that in our own personal lives too. We know we don't like this guy over here, but we kind of forgot why we don't like him. So there's that. But then on the broader spectrum, I think, you know, and this is a little bit of a delicate thing. On the one hand, it's important just to say, you know, this happened. This is an example of some of the things that happened, but I think it's also important to say this is an example, okay? Because there were a lot of other things that happened. And that's not to diminish what happened here. It's just to try and avoid sort of oh, well, it happened over there, so it doesn't really, I'm glad we weren't those folks, because they really made a hash of it. Well, you know, guess what? A lot of that stuff happened at various times. I mean, one of the things I struggle with is that when it's called the worst example or the worst incident of racial violence in the nation's history. Well, okay, but you count, say, the Indian Wars? I mean, we had we have a big Indian heritage here in Oklahoma, and especially in eastern Oklahoma. But in western Oklahoma, they had a very significant battle that some people would call massacre, is the Battle of the Washita between George Custer and some Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians. And it wasn't much of a battle. The Indians pretty much got wiped out. Or do you count, I mean, you know, there were incidents in especially in Louisiana after the Civil War, where it's not clear how many people got killed. Do you count things like the New York draft riot, which didn't actually start as a race riot, but it's got a racial component to it. So that's a long way of saying, I think it's a way to highlight that these sorts of things happen, and maybe to invite people to look around their own communities or look around the country at large and say, okay, so did we have this here? And does this explain maybe why some folks are, you know, angry? Or I mean, even here in Tulsa, I learned this 20 years ago. There are a lot of people who think they live in a bad neighborhood or live in a bad house or something like that because of what happened in 1921. And almost without exception, that really has very little to do with it. It's everything that's happened since that has led them to where they are. So that's kind of a long, convoluted answer, but I hope it makes some sense.
Yeah, very definitely. I promised myself that I was going to give other people who are listening today a chance to ask some questions. And although I could go on asking my own for another, well, as long as we want to stay on, that's not going to be fair to some other people who may have their own thoughts. So I'm going to invite people to raise their hands if they have questions. By the way, do you prefer if I call you Randy or Mr. Krehbiel?
Well, no, Randy's fine.
Okay, who have questions for Randy? I see David, no, actually, I think Ron and Lisa were first and then David. So Ron and Lisa, please unmute yourself, and whichever one of you is going to ask.
That's me. Randy, being the one of the lawyers on the Zoom, I was wondering, what were the failures of the legal system at that time? Were there any efforts on the part of the legal system, one, from a criminal standpoint, to prosecute those involved in the burning of the Greenwood, or two, were there any civil actions taken to try to reimburse members of the Black community for the economic losses that they had at the time? And then ask you to bring it up to date. Have there been any movements currently to reimburse economically the families that had those losses during that time period?
Let me just jump in, Ron. Randy covers a lot of that in the book, and I didn't get a chance to ask about that. So you're asking the right guy. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I have some knowledge of it. There were people arrested, you know, in the day or two following what happened, Black and white. And just to be clear, we don't really know how many people were killed, but we do know there were Blacks and whites both killed during this incident. And so then in a couple of weeks after, one of the things I learned in this is how much more quickly the legal system moved in those days. But so within a couple of weeks, a grand jury was convened, and they issued, I think it was 88 indictments. Most of those were against Black people because this was perceived as a Negro uprising because of the Black people who went to the courthouse. So any of the Black people Black men who went to the courthouse were indicted. Now, some of these identities were pretty vague. Like one of the indictments was against a guy known as Fatty. He's only identified as Fatty, and some things like that. And what they found is that almost everybody who was indicted had fled the city. As far as I know, nobody, there were a few people who pleaded guilty. There was one guy one black man who was convicted on a gun charge and sent to the penitentiary. The chief of police was indicted on several counts that basically related to dereliction of duty, and he was convicted and removed from office. Some of the charges dealt with the riot, some did not. I mean, so he was among the Tulsa Police Department was under investigation by the state attorney general at the time of the massacre. It was being investigated for various things, including operating a car theft ring out of the car theft division of the Tulsa Police Department. They were stealing cars and then turning them in for the rewards. The chief was alleged to be, he'd been a private detective. It was alleged that people would come to him with various problems and he'd say, well, we can't really handle that as a police department, but you can turn it over to my private detective agency and we'll look into it for you. Some of you may be familiar with the Osage murders, Killers of the Flower Moon. There's going to be a movie coming out about that. There was a situation where a large number of Osage Indians just northwest of Oklahoma City, or I'm sorry, just northwest of Tulsa, were being murdered for their head rights, which were very valuable because of the oil and gas. So, and this was going on at the same time as the Tulsa Massacre. I'm telling you all this to tell you that while at the same time the race massacre and the aftermath were going on, the police chief of Tulsa was working as a private detective in Osage County, trying to track down some of the murderers. So he was removed from office. And after that happened, everything just kind of shut down on the criminal side. There was not much interest in pursuing that. Now, on the civil side, there were hundreds of lawsuits filed by black property owners and white property owners, because there were white property owners that lost their stuff too, both in downtown. When the shooting started, there was really a riot in downtown Tulsa, and it involved people breaking into stores that had firearms. And it started out with them taking firearms, but before it was all over, they'd pretty much stolen everything. So it started there, and then of course you had this, utter destruction of the black business district. And some of those businesses were owned by whites. So what it sort of came down to this. There was what I would say was a test case. I don't know that it was ever officially identified as that, but there was a white man named William Redfern who owned a store in Greenwood, and he sued his insurance company to try and get them to pay. Most insurance policies in those days had a clause that they didn't have to pay if it was a riot, insurrection, act of God. And so what he tried to do was prove that this was not an insurrection, that the destruction of Greenwood was a planned operation by the officials of Tulsa, the police department and the mayor and some other people. And the case wound up before the Oklahoma Supreme Court in 1926. They ruled against him, and that was pretty much the end of the lawsuits until the early 2000s. Fortunately, we have a lot of the testimony or summary of actually it's the pleadings, but the pleadings include a lot of the testimony from both the trial court and then, some of the stuff that was filed in the appeal. And so there's a lot in that case about what happened. And I depended on that quite a bit when I was writing that section of the book. So then, in the late 1990s, the state commission was appointed. And part of the idea was to try and get sufficient evidence to file some kind of a lawsuit to recover damages from the city, the state, the county, whoever they could get money from. And there was a guy named Charles Ogletree, who was a law professor at Harvard, a pretty well-known civil rights attorney. He was involved in it. They filed this lawsuit on behalf. At that time, there were quite a few survivors from the massacre. They were all elderly, but there were probably 80 or 100 or more of them still around in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he filed this lawsuit. It failed at the district, circuit, and U.S. Supreme Court, primarily because of the statute of limitations. And so we have a lawsuit going now that's been filed, and I'm no lawyer. The people who are lawyers tell me they think it has no chance, and it's mainly just to try and get attention. But there's a state lawsuit out there, and they're suing on the grounds that the city, the Chamber of Commerce, I don't know, they listed several entities in there, have been an ongoing public nuisance to the Black people of Tulsa. And since the public nuisance ordinance has no statute of limitations, they're trying to press that. And it's a little bit ironic. They're basing this on the argument that the former state attorney general made when he sued the opioid manufacturers in state court. He sued them on the basis of being a public nuisance, and he won at the district court level. That's in state district court. But when it went to the state Supreme Court, they threw it out. So I don't know what that means for our current argument. And now we're transitioning more from, there are 3 people that we know of who claim to be survivors. There's 2 107-year-old women and 1 100-year-old man. And, as would be the case with anything that happened that long ago, there's some dispute as to whether they were actually here or not. I mean, my sort of feeling, look, it's 207-year-old Black women. They're survivors of something is kind of the way I look at it. But, that just seems like it. So we're transitioning now to where they're trying to get some kind of compensation for the families, the descendants of people who lost property. And that just gets into a really complicated situation. And, there's sort of this disagreement over which should be the primary priority, whether the first priority should be getting some kind of restitution or reparations for the community, or whether we're trying to get reparations for individuals. And, so there's a lot of people who think it just makes more sense, and you've got more chance of doing it if you try and do something like, providing, well, sort of like what what Evanston, Illinois has done, where they provided some funds for Black folks to buy homes or things like that. They don't have to prove a specific damage against them. They just have to say, I think you have to have lived there a certain period of time. I'm not even sure. I don't know the details. I just know that they provided some money to try and help Black folks buy homes in Evanston, Illinois. Or, there's a lot of things that going on there. Again, that's a really long answer, and I hope that's told you what you were hoping to find out.
Thanks. I promised David you would go next, and I don't think you are strangers, if I remember right.
That's right.
No, we've talked before.
We met on another Zoom call for the Teaneck Film Festival, myself and Randy. You know, by the way, I'm going to put a link to your Amazon page in the chat window so people can buy your book and look at other books that you've written. But I wanted to just relate something and get your comment. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the riot. And I was hearing an interview with George Will, who is one of America's most prominent conservative writers and public intellectuals. And he made a very revealing and interesting statement. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Why is it that I, who had an Ivy League education, a PhD in history from Princeton, and a newspaper column read that appears in hundreds of newspapers, why is it that I had to wait till my 80th year to hear that we had a pogrom in America?" And as it spoke to the, yeah. And I wonder if you just comment on that and the general blindness in America at large to these kinds of things.
Well, and I don't remember if you and I have talked about this, but I've come to the conclusion that history, and not just in America, but everywhere, serves two different and often conflicting purposes. And so the history that a lot of us learn and that a lot of our parents and politicians want taught in our public schools, Oklahoma, like a lot of states, is having that fight right now, is a history that, you know, we're all a bunch of good folks who are just, have good intentions, and yeah, there were some bad things happened, but that was a long time ago, and they really don't have anything to do with us now. It's a history that's intended to, build up a sense of place, of pride in who you are, and maybe some kind of a common narrative that everybody agrees on as we go forward. And then there's the other kind of history that requires, the critical thinking and delving into, what really happened. And I can't speak for George Will, but most of us don't ever get to that point, except maybe in college, if you happen to have, a professor, or if you're a history major or whatever. Probably, I'm often asked, what was the most surprising thing that I've learned from all of this? And I have to say, the thing that was the most difficult for me was coming to grips with just how ingrained race and racism was into every aspect of American life in the early 1920s. And by coming to grips with that, I began to see how some of these things often unintentionally carry forward to today. That's a long answer and maybe not entirely on point to David's question, except to say that I think we have to consider what the purpose of history, learning history is. Is the purpose of history to understand the world as it really is, or is it to understand the world as we would like it to be? And I think, in public schools, and even I say public schools, in schools in general, doesn't have to be public, it could be private or homeschool, online, whatever. The easy route to take is to give this sort of sanitized version that presents our town, our city, or our state, our country as, a place where everybody has good intentions. But the reality is that hasn't always been the case, but it's hard to get into that because, the public doesn't want to hear that. I'll give an example that has nothing to do with history, but years ago, the provost at Oklahoma State University told me that he'd been going around campaigning for an extra year of math in Oklahoma high schools. Now in Oklahoma, most of the high schools are quite small. We've got over 500 high schools and or 500 school districts. We have more high schools than that, and they're quite small, and they're in small towns, small communities. And he's going around trying to require an extra year of math. So he goes to this one small school that has an excellent reputation for turning out students, and he lays out his plan. He says, so what do you, he says to the math teacher, what do you think about this extra year of math? And the math teacher says, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. And he said, why? And he said, because right now I'm teaching that math class and it's only got the kids in it who want to be in there. If I have to teach that math class to everybody, first of all, I'm going to have to either water it down so it's not as effective, or I'm going to have to flunk 2/3 of the kids in class and I'm going to lose my job. And I think that same thing applies to history, right? I mean, there are a lot of history teachers who would like to, really get into some of this. Okay, these are the issues. What do you think about them? But in the back of their mind, they're afraid they're going to get fired. So,
and by the way, that whole issue is being writ large now under the name of critiques of teaching critical race theory in the schools. Now, nobody is actually teaching critical race theory, which is something that lives in the law school world in public schools, but it's become a battle cry for people who only want to see the self-congratulatory version of history taught in the schools versus people who want to, get people and kids to actually think about what's happened in American history. So it is certainly very much a current question. I think we're going to allow time for 2 more questions. I see Mel Gardner, who also had a question in the chat, and I'm going to, before you ask the question you're going to ask now, I'm also going to invite Randy to talk about the documentary that was done related to his book. But Mel, go ahead with your question, and then Diane Kosarski, and I think that'll be it. So you're on.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm just wondering, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that Desmond Tutu was part of was such a big piece of acknowledgement and truth-telling in that culture. And it just seems like there was something present there that allowed that to take place that the US has never, or perhaps has not, embraced. I don't know how much you know about that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or if you can reflect on what the differences are between the US and South Africa in that case.
I do know about that commission, and that's been mentioned here. Here's the problem you run into in Tulsa and in Oklahoma and in large swaths of the United States, is that there's not a whole lot of incentive for the white population to get involved in something like that. I mean, so Tulsa in the last census actually turned out to be is it a minority, majority? In other words, the white non-Hispanic population is less than half the population here now, but it's still the largest population. And for most of the time that I've lived in Tulsa, if a white person didn't want to have to deal with the complaints of a black person, they didn't have to do it. They could just ignore them because they were, around 10% of the population. And so it was big enough they could be kind of noisy when they wanted to be, but they weren't large enough to have any real political leverage. And so, I think that's kind of one of the things. Look, I mean, most of what happens, this is another one of those things that I knew, but as I've been in newspapers for, 40 something years now, I've really come to understand most of the things that happen because of power and money and, who gets to make the rules, who gets to name the buildings and all of that stuff. So in Tulsa and in Oklahoma, we have not reached a point where the white people feel any inclination to give up the power to do that. And the other groups don't have the political strength to do much about it. They have to pretty much just cajole, and they've made some headway. And you know, in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, we're seeing a shift in thinking on a lot of these things. But you know, it's like it is nationally. But I just think everybody in the United States, regardless of their ethnic background, their race, and look, a lot of us are actually multi-ethnic, multi-racial, but you know, all of us have to come to grips with our history, and in, you know, especially the racial part of it, because if you were on the receiving end of it, if you were a Black person or an Indian person in Oklahoma, an American Indian person in Oklahoma, you know, you've got to decide, what is it I'm willing to accept as you know, an apology, as restitution, as something, so that I can, you know, we can all go on, or is there anything I would accept? And if you're a white person, you have to be able to accept, yeah, I'm kind of in the position I'm in, because maybe not entirely. I mean, I've got a story I tell about my family that kind of illustrates that, and I won't go into it now, but basically, you know, I don't come from what a lot of white people would consider privileged. But if you look at it from the standpoint of the American Indians or Black people, or you know, in other parts of the country, Asian or whatever, yeah, I've benefited from a lot of things that those folks didn't have. And so, you know, I don't know if what you're talking about exactly would work here, but I do think that, you know, part of what we're going through as a country right now is, you know, kind of a reckoning. And as the country becomes more diverse in its identity, you know, there's more pressure to come to terms with that.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Diane, last question.
Thank you for your very thoughtful responses to our questions. I wonder if you can point to something that happened to you personally that shifted your point of view enough to be so deeply interested in this topic and willing to kind of step outside the fishbowl water that we all drink in as white people, you know, that requires a little effort to get beyond.
Well,
Did you
yeah,
tell us about that?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any one thing, other than as a reporter, at some point I came to realize that to really do my job, I needed to understand other, you know, whoever it was I was writing about. So I was assigned to write about this, and I'd written some other stories before this on just sort of, I guess you'd say black-white relationships in the city. And as I got into it, I just, you know, I found that there were these interesting histories, and I've always been interested in history. I went to college thinking I was going to actually major in history, and I fell in with the wrong crowd and wound up working on the student newspaper and went into that. And so I've always been interested in that. And I've always thought of myself, you know, there are different kinds of reporters, and some reporters are more, I guess you'd say, expositional or whatever. For me, I'm most comfortable explaining things. And so I got into okay, I need to explain to my audience, which is at the newspaper, which is mainly white Republicans, basically, why this is important to them. And so to do that, I had to really kind of open my head up, I guess. But I think some of it goes back to the way you were raised. I mean, I was raised on a farm in western Oklahoma. We were 9 miles from the nearest town. The nearest town had 800 people in it. And race was never an issue then. I'm not saying there wasn't racism. I'm just saying we were all a bunch of white people. And so we never, as a result, because it was not an issue, I never had a lot of the racist stuff pushed at me. And in later life, I mean, I came to realize that a lot of that was there, but I just kind of grew up with sort of an open attitude on it, not because I did anything. It just was the way it was. But anyway, to get back to more recent times, I just think as I went along, I realized to write about this, I need to understand these people, and to understand them, I need to talk to them. And more than that, I need to listen to them, because what people think, I think David's heard me say this, what people think is often not as important as why they think it. And if you don't understand why people think the way they do, you can't understand what they think. I mean, I think there's a big tendency among us as human beings to hear somebody we disagree with and say, these people that's crazy. I'm just going to shut them out. We see that on social media now. If you don't agree with somebody on your Facebook or Twitter or whatever you're on, you block them. And if there's too many people on whatever your platform is, you go to, whatever the new ones are, Telegram or Getter or something like that. And I just think that's a big mistake. You have to listen to people you disagree with to understand why you disagree with them.
Thank you.
Dan, you're on mute. If you're
As I was saying, Randy, I want to thank you very much for what has been an extremely informative and valuable discussion. We could carry on a lot longer, but there are limits. And to thank you for this remarkable book that you've written, and I gather it was a long-term effort, which I recommend to everyone. To learn about exactly what happened then and why it matters and why it's important. We're going to have some announcements now, but if you wish, you're welcome to stay on, because usually after announcements, I'm going to leave this to our Zoom leaders here. Usually after announcements, we have sort of some open conversation. So you're welcome to stay on if you wish for that. Okay.
I'll
David?
I'll take it from here. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
By the way, I'm going to also put Randy's page at the Tulsa World in the chat room. He writes on a number of subjects. It's very interesting. I would